Welcome to the Center Square Radio Hour for the fourth weekend of November 2024. I'm your host, Chris Krug. The Center Square and the Radio Hour are projects of the Franklin News Foundation, a 501c3, independent, nonprofit, nonpartisan news service. Established in 2019, the Center Square Newswire publishes original taxpayer-centric straight news that focuses on the size, scope, and effectiveness of local, state, and federal government. On the Center Square Radio Hour, our journalists explore their top stories, adding insight to the headlines. We'll also present thoughts on the economy from Dr. Orphe Divondi, PhD economist, and bring you the latest in K-12 education news from our Franklin News Foundation's Chalkboard News team. This week on the Radio Hour, we'll discuss President-elect Donald Trump as his transition to the White House picks up steam. We'll hear about the controversy in Pennsylvania's Senate recount, and we'll look at Congress's scrutiny of FEMA. We'll be right back with all that and more in the Center Square Radio Hour.
Are you tired of news that puts politics over people? At the nonprofit Franklin News Foundation, we believe in putting people over politics by delivering nonpartisan news and audio content that serves you, the American taxpayer. With Franklin News Foundation, you can read fact-based, state-focused news for free at thecentersquare.com. You can listen to civil, balanced conversations between policy experts through our podcast network at americastalking.com. Or you can get in-depth news on K-12 education spending, curriculum, and school safety at chalkboardnews.com. It's all free through Franklin, where we put you, the American taxpayer, first in every story, episode, and conversation. And it's only possible through our supporters. Together, we can produce content that puts people over politics and brings Americans the news they deserve. Become a supporter today at franklinnews.org/donate. Once again, that's franklinnews.org/donate.
Welcome back to the Center Square Radio Hour. I'm Chris Krug. With more on President-elect Trump's ongoing transition to the White House, it's Dan McCaleb.
President-elect Donald Trump continues to fill out his cabinet with high-profile nominees. Matt Gaetz, Trump's controversial selection to run the Justice Department as Attorney General, withdrew his name from consideration amid allegations of sexual impropriety. Trump instead tapped former Florida Attorney General Pam Bondi to replace Gaetz. But arguably the biggest news of the week was the president-elect confirming that he plans to declare a national emergency over the border crisis, which would allow him to use the military to help secure the southern border and participate in his plan to potentially deport massive numbers of violent criminal offenders in the U.S. illegally. Joining me to discuss all things presidential transition is Casey Harper, Washington, D.C. Bureau Chief for the Center Square. Casey, let's start with the border. Tell us about Trump's plans there.
Yeah, I mean, if you're a Trump supporter, you're really happy to see this. You're happy to see the level of aggression, the level of earnestness that Trump and his team are showing, not only on these picks, getting them out quick, picking mostly ones that are appealing to the base, and then also just making clear that the border is going to be a top priority and taking those extra measures. I think that's what, was a top campaign issue, and that's what a lot of Trump supporters wanted. And here we go. I mean, we're underway for what could be a very interesting few years if he really does follow through on some of these promises, in particular the mass deportations. And so, as you said, President-elect Donald Trump, he online on Truth Social posted basically confirmed reports that he was planning to use the military to deal with the border crisis. And essentially, he says that the southern border crisis is an invasion. He called it an invasion. There's been millions, estimates vary, but at least 10 million illegal immigrants have come into the country since Biden took office. We really don't know the full number because how can you track, the people who come in and totally evade law enforcement? It's just an estimate. But so, he's calling that's an invasion, and therefore I have the right to use the military. It's interesting. People kind of assume that this means that he's going to put the military at the southern border to prevent people from coming in. Now, that may be true. I think that'd be a reasonable assumption. But interesting, in the way that the original statement is worded, it says to reverse the Biden invasion through a mass deportation program. And so it seems to me the way I read that is actually the military is going to be involved in this mass deportation. I don't know what that looks like exactly, but it's going to be beefing up resources to ICE and also local sheriff's departments. You may remember, Dan, that part of the Trump plan is likely, if they really go through it, it is likely going to involve partnering with local law enforcement to help them deport. And so then I guess the National Guard or whoever it ends up being could be extra manpower to make this happen, just security maybe for those agents who go in or whatever it is. But, local law enforcement, they know where these people live. They know the neighborhoods. They've been in the communities a long time and probably know it a lot better. And they have the numbers in a way that ICE just does not. So it's going to be really interesting to see if this is a very controversial move, but if you're really serious about it, it may take this kind of manpower, Dan.
Yeah, and the move to call up the military to participate in what we think is a deportation plan, it's at odds with a number of governors from blue states across the country. Illinois Governor J.B. Pritzker this week said that plan is likely unconstitutional, illegal. California Governor Gavin Newsom has pushed back. Other governors have pushed back against the plan. Many of these are so-called sanctuary states where they don't allow law enforcement to cooperate with immigration and customs enforcement. So the potential for some conflict with the states is there, yes?
Yeah, definitely. And I think there's a few Democrats out there who are looking to make their name, prepare themselves for future presidential runs, and build their donor base by becoming the foil to Donald Trump. I mean, you've already seen it. Newsom has already said that, he's going to launch this effort to slow Trump down because Democrats don't have the House or the Senate. This idea of who's going to stand up to Trump is a popular one in the Democratic Party. And so, yes, you see some of these governors saying it's going to be them. And there might be some legal fights. But honestly, Dan, there are millions and millions of illegal immigrants to deport without ever touching these states. I mean, there's tens of millions in the country. So Trump could easily, make a lot of progress on his stated goal without even winning those legal battles.
Let's transition to Gaetz withdrawing his name from consideration for the Attorney General's seat. I think probably many Republicans in the Senate in particular are relieved at that. He was a controversial selection to begin with. Shortly after he was nominated, he resigned from his U.S. House seat. Now there's certainly far less controversial candidate that he's nominated to replace Gaetz. Do you think in Bondi, the former Florida Attorney General, do you think senators are somewhat relieved at Gaetz's withdrawal?
There's certainly a few moderate or senators and probably even a few more than just the moderates who are relieved. They don't have to make that hard vote. I think a lot of Trump's most staunch supporters really liked Gaetz because he has shown a really aggressive mentality and a willingness to not back down, even under intense outward pressure. So, of course, he famously ousted House Speaker Kevin McCarthy and almost by himself. I mean, he had a handful of lawmakers with him, but remember, they only needed, I think, 5 to prevent a confirmation. And at times they only had 9 votes preventing McCarthy from being confirmed. And despite intense pressure from the media, from the outside world, he brought Congress to a halt. I'm sure McCarthy and him are this is sweet revenge for McCarthy, first off. But, think about how many Republicans were pressuring Gaetz, who was leading that charge, to just give in. You're making Republicans look bad. And he stood his ground. And I think he earned the respect of a lot of, Trump supporters by doing that because they were skeptical of McCarthy at that point. And he just showed he had a backbone. And so I think that's how he got the job, actually. So Trump loyalists were kind of excited about Gaetz despite the allegations because they really wanted someone who was going to use the DOJ to address a lot of the problems, to clean out the FBI, to prosecute some people, put some people in jail who they see deserve it, and it's a long time coming. All that being said, it's not happening. Senators, probably relieved from mostly. And I think Pam is going to be an easier vote. Now just Hegseth is the most controversial vote. There's kind of a political wisdom a little bit, though, in throwing out a candidate, having them be knocked down. And so then they almost have to take your second choice. Negotiating, they turn down the first thing. Then they seem unreasonable if they won't take. When you cave, it's like they're meeting in the middle by taking Pam and these other nominees.
Thank you for joining us today, Casey. Listeners can keep up with all things presidential transition and more at thecentersquare.com.
A big thanks to Dan and Casey. You're listening to the Center Square Radio Hour. I'm your host, Chris Krug. With more on the ballot controversy in Pennsylvania, let's now go to Eliana Kernodle.
Pennsylvania's state Supreme Court told counties on Monday that ballots with dating errors cannot be counted as valid. Joining me with more on this story is the Center Square's Pennsylvania editor, Kristen Smith. Kristen, what is the background behind this ruling?
This ruling came from an emergency order that the state and Republican National Party had asked for The counting is still going on in Pennsylvania between U.S. Senator Bob Casey, who's the incumbent Democrat, and Dave McCormick, who is his Republican challenger. The race has been very, very close. I think as of November 21st, which is today, they are, based on unofficial results, roughly 17,000 votes apart, with McCormick being ahead. The reason that this is significant is because there is an argument over what amount of provisional ballots and mail-in ballots that have particular errors should be counted. Now, it's important to note that it's well agreed by McCormick's campaign, by news media, including the AP, that Casey, there's no way that he can make up that gap, no matter how small it is that he is going to lose. Statistically, it is impossible. Every vote that, is provisional and has errors would have to go his way. And even if it did, it really still wouldn't make much of a difference. We can get back into more of that in a little bit. But so the, McCormick campaign, backed by the state and national Republican parties, comes in and wants the state Supreme Court to weigh in again on the particular issue of ballots with no dates or the wrong dates. And this is an issue that's been litigated before, previously when McCormick ran for Senate against Dr. Oz and lost in the primary. And the Supreme Court has said, for varying reasons, that if the ballots do not have the correct dates, that they cannot count. So, unsurprisingly, they reiterated the same thing earlier this week. So the provisional ballots that are still hanging up in the air, they will not be counted. That being said, Casey exercised his right to an automatic recount just because the preliminary results were so close. We're in the middle of that recount right now. And so far, only a couple counties have finished that process, and we're looking at vote differences of maybe 1 to 2 votes here or there. So very small changes so far, but none of these counties were where the candidates were even close. We're waiting for the bigger, more contested counties in southeast Pennsylvania to come in and see how many they got right and how many they got wrong.
And so what were some of the specific concerns that the court addressed in the ruling?
Certainly. So in Pennsylvania, we're still fairly new to counting mail-in ballots. And one of the issues that's kind of come up, since 2020 is that there are voters who come into the precincts on election day and fill out their ballots in front of election workers and then hand them to the election workers. And the reason that they do this is perhaps, they never got their actual mail-in ballot. It was lost in the mail or just came too late, or they were unable to get the mail-in ballots to the county election office before 8 p.m. on election day, or they were worried that they couldn't mail it in time, so they just showed up at the precinct to fill it out. And when they do that, they have to sign it, date it, and put it in a secrecy envelope and then hand it to the election worker. And according to the Casey campaign, the election worker then has to date it themselves, and then it's, done appropriately and it's valid. They are arguing, the Casey campaign, that didn't happen in some cases, and you're looking at thousands of ballots that have a dating error to this extent that they think that it's disenfranchising not to count them, especially when the voter themselves didn't make the error, but that the election worker did. Supreme Court didn't get into that minute level of detail, but what they did say was the dating errors are a problem. You cannot count them, at least not in this election.
And this ruling was 4-3. What was the dissenting opinion?
Sure. So the dissenting opinion, which was 3 Democratic judges, including the Chief Justice on the court, their argument was a little bit more procedural in the sense that they didn't feel that it was necessary to file an emergency order. They felt that there was appropriate avenues through the lower courts that could have handled this. And so their entire premises for why it should have been dismissed was ultimately because of that, not necessarily on the merits of the underlying case. And that is true with earlier litigation that they ultimately weighed in on again with the situation as recently as September. It was a procedural reason. Plaintiffs had come in and said, this dating requirement is disenfranchising. We need to change it. And the Supreme Court struck it down and said the reason that we're not going to weigh in on this any further is because the plaintiffs only filed it in 2 counties, in Philadelphia and Allegheny County, and the Supreme Court needed them to file it in every single county. So they're not really passing judgment on whether the dating issue is something that can make ballots invalid. But really, they are saying the ways that this has been brought to them so far are not sufficient for their involvement.
And some comments by the Bucks County Commission chairwoman have been talked about a lot. What were those, and what did the court have to say about them?
A few days after the election and a few days after Senator-elect McCormick was determined the winner, the Bucks County commissioners held a meeting to decide whether or not these provisional ballots that had these dating errors would count. Even though the Supreme Court's been pretty clear, Bucks County had roughly 400 votes that fell into this category. And the chairwoman, she made some, I don't want to say inflammatory, but she made some very strong comments that really got the attention of the entire country, not to mention the Supreme Court itself, where she said, "I think we all know that precedent by a court does not matter anymore in this country, and people violate laws anytime they want. So for me, if I violate this law, it's because I want a court to pay attention." And this really annoyed some members of the Supreme Court, and you can tell because there was a concurring opinion that called this out specifically and was very intent on reminding local officials that they don't have the authority to interpret election law. Only the Supreme Court does. So it's clear that that riled, or that really triggered them, for lack of a better word. It's not clear from standing on the outside perspective. Perhaps that was the chairwoman's entire point, was to get them to weigh in quickly, even if she completely disagreed with their decision-making process on this. But it is something that certainly the eyes were already on Pennsylvania in this election from the get-go. Everyone wants to know if Trump or Harris would win. And then the fact that McCormick and Casey are so close is really, people are on edge wanting to know how this is going to turn out. Even though it seems broadly accepted that McCormick will win in the end, it's just an issue that's really brought to light how many shortcomings our election law still has, how many loose ends they need to really tie up before voters feel 100% confident, and perhaps maybe the rest of the country stops putting a microscope on us and what we do in our elections.
Well, Kristen, thank you for your insights on this story. Listeners can keep up with this story and more at thecentersquare.com.
Thank you, Eliana and Kristen. You've been listening to the Center Square Radio Hour. I'm your host, Chris Krug. With more on lawmakers' scrutiny of FEMA, we'll now return to Dan McCaleb.
The Federal Emergency Management Agency, also known as FEMA, was under significant scrutiny this week as House Republicans grilled FEMA's director at a hearing over its responses to the natural disasters, including Hurricanes Helene and Milton. Joining me to discuss this today is Casey Harper, Washington, D.C. Bureau Chief for the Center Square. Casey, you covered that hearing. Tell us about it.
Yeah, the hearing was really interesting, and what would have otherwise been a pretty boring hearing about how aid is being distributed and the processes and ways that they go about informing the community about, what could have been normally a boring hearing turned out to be pretty explosive, really interesting. And that's because, Dan, FEMA has 4 big problems right now. The first is that they're giving hundreds of millions of dollars to illegal immigrants, to migrants who are coming into the U.S. to help them get housed and settled. And that spending became really controversial because of those hurricanes you mentioned, Milton and Helene, where a lot of Americans were struggling, felt like they weren't getting enough aid. And of course, the Biden administration's defenders and FEMA's defenders have been quick to point out that the aid to the migrants does not directly take out of the same pot of money that goes towards, hurricane relief. But at the same time, it was a bad look, and it critics said it was misplaced priorities. Why are the migrants getting hundreds of millions and Americans weren't getting, in the eyes of some, the relief they needed? And there's many people who still have not really gotten the relief they need from the hurricane. And so that's one point. They have this migrant problem. The second problem they have is one of their news broke that one of their employees was telling people not to go to help homes that had Trump signs in front. And of course, as you would imagine, this was very explosive. And then when the employee was fired, the employee is going on cable news saying, I was just following orders. We were told not to go to homes with Trump. So this came from came from my leadership. And by the way, this was the culture at FEMA anyway. I was just going according to the culture, which was explosive. It came up at the hearing, and lawmakers are grilling about that. The third problem is FEMA does a lot of spending on DEI. And that has become, they've gotten away with it mostly, but now that they're under the microscope, it's like, hey, what about all this DEI spending? Dan, at thecentersquare.com, I've reported about FEMA's DEI spending, and in particular, in FEMA's strategic plan for 2022, 2026, their number one priority is, equity, diversity, inclusion, putting equity back into emergency response and emergency management. Responding to actual disasters is their third priority. Number two is related to climate change. So that's the third problem they have from lawmakers. And number four, quickly, is DOGE. The Trump administration is taking power, and he has a few very powerful allies who are wielding an axe and looking for government agencies to cut, to trim down, to clean house in. So it's a bad time for FEMA to be in the spotlight for all their controversy.
Well, let's talk about points 2 and 3 there, Casey, because they seem to be in conflict with each other. As you mentioned, FEMA's top priority, according to their strategic plan, is diversity, equity, and inclusion. Yet you have FEMA people essentially saying avoid homes with Trump signs in response to the hurricane. That doesn't seem very equitable to me.
Yeah, there's definitely some hypocrisy and irony in it. DEI has become a nice packaging on what is really just kind of the liberal racial identity politics, gender identity politics agenda. It's kind of turning every agency into a religious institution, but instead of a traditional religion, it's this moral code and hierarchy and, sort of other gospel about what it takes to be a good person. And that's basically being as diverse as possible and deferring as much to the diverse people as possible. And so on that chain, Trump supporters are at the bottom of the food chain. They're the opposite of diverse and equitable. And so it's really not about everyone being even. It's more about ranking everyone in a new social strata into different classes. And Trump supporters are at the lowest class in that system.
And you also referenced DOGE, the new federal agency that's being headed by private citizens Elon Musk and Vivek Ramaswamy. They're targeting these DEI initiatives and DEI spending across agencies, not just FEMA, but every single agency. Do you think DEI in the federal government under Trump is going away?
Yeah, I think so. The centersquare.com got some exclusive access to some legislation that was coming out in Congress this week, and there was other legislation as well, and they're all targeting DEI, cleaning the federal government out of these DEI policies. There's staff, there's trainings, there are all kinds of different ways it manifests at different agencies with various strength, but it costs a lot of money, and so Congress has power over it. So you're seeing it from Congress, and you're also seeing Trump's nominees like Brendan Carr, who's picked to lead the FCC. He's talking about cleaning out DEI. Pete Hegseth, the sort of embattled now nominee to be Secretary of Defense, he's talking about getting rid of DEI. And so I think you're seeing a lot of momentum of it. And of course, Vivek Ramaswamy and Elon Musk are ready to take an axe to DEI. Musk has called it the woke mind virus. He's made it kind of his mission to destroy it. And he has the president's ear right now. So all the markers are pointing in that direction.
Casey, thank you for joining us today. Listeners can keep up with this story and more at thecentersquare.com.
Thanks to Dan and Casey for that update. That'll do it for the first half of the Center Square Radio Hour. After the break, we'll look at more top stories from across the nation. Why have the Tampa Bay Rays suspended work on their stadium? What will education policy look like under the Trump administration? And why do the prices of some goods fall and others not? All that and more when we return on the Center Square Radio Hour. Welcome back to the Center Square Radio Hour. I'm Chris Krug. Here are this week's quick hits, some of the original reporting you may have missed at thecentersquare.com. A Venezuelan man convicted of murdering Laken Riley in Georgia was sentenced to life in prison on Wednesday. Jose Ibarra, 26, was convicted on all 10 charges, including murder and an attempted sexual assault tied to Riley's February 22nd death near her Athens apartment. Authorities say Ibarra, a suspected member of the Venezuelan gang Tren de Aragua, had been in the U.S. illegally since 2022. Riley's death has fueled Republican criticism of federal border policies, citing them as a contributing factor. Manhattan District Attorney Alvin Bragg said Tuesday that his office will oppose President-elect Donald Trump's motion to dismiss his felony conviction in New York. Bragg said that despite plans to oppose Trump's motion, his office would agree to hit pause on the proceedings pending the judge's decision on Trump's motion to dismiss. Bragg also suggested the case could wait until Trump finished his term in the White House. Trump was convicted of 34 counts of falsifying business records for disguising hush money payments to an adult film actress as legal costs ahead of the 2016 election. North Carolina fatalities linked to Hurricane Helene have risen to 103, the Division of Public Health in the Department of Health and Human Services says. Helene, a Category 4 hurricane when it made landfall in Florida on September 26th, is deemed responsible for 232 deaths across 7 states, according to information gathered by the Center Square. Republican lawmakers in Pennsylvania are pushing to position the state as a leader in cryptocurrency investments. State Representative Mike Cabell introduced House Bill 2664, known as the Strategic Bitcoin Reserve Act, which would allow up to 10% of the state's general fund, emergency savings, and investment funds to be invested in Bitcoin. While proponents see this as an opportunity to embrace digital finance, critics warn it could pose significant risks to the state's financial stability. California gas prices could increase by as much as $1.15 per gallon next year, driven by a combination of new carbon credit rules, taxes, refinery shutdowns, and regulations. This would require the typical California to make up to $1,000 per year more in pre-tax income to break even, according to an analysis from a professor at the USC Marshall School of Business. Days after the November election, the California Air Resources Board, a regulatory commission almost entirely appointed by the governor, passed new updates to the state's low-carbon fuel standard. The updates require producers of high-emission fuels to purchase additional credits from cleaner fuel producers. You can find more on these stories and others like them from across the country at thecentersquare.com. We'll be right back with more on the Center Square Radio Hour.
Teacher Lauren Johnson returned all the graded essays but one. He believed that one student was capable of more.
I don't believe taking the middle of the road is your philosophy. This time, write something you really believe.
The student wrote a new one about excellence. Instead of just grading an essay, Mr. Johnson changed a life. I am that student. I became a writer, and I wrote this to thank him.
Thank a teacher and pass it on from passiton.com.
Welcome back to the Center Square Radio Hour. I'm Chris Krug. With more on the controversy surrounding the Rays' new stadium, we'll now go to John Stife.
This week, the Pinellas County Commission voted to again delay approving bonds for a new Tampa Bay Rays stadium. I'm here with Center Square reporter Steve Wilson. Steve, give us more of the overarching look on this Rays stadium deal. Is there a lot of concern that the new stadium is not going to happen?
I think that the team decided with that letter, the letter that they dropped before the Pinellas County Commission that said that we're not going to be able to deliver a stadium because you guys are welshing on your part of the deal, kind of definitely was a poison pill. It was interesting. I was watching the St. Pete City Council. They're talking about that as well, because they're a third of this. Just imagine this as a three-leg stool. You've got taxpayer money from both Pinellas County and the city of St. Pete. Then you've got the team coming up with the other third. The problem is the county commission said, we really don't want to do this deal right now. We just got hit on October 9th by Hurricane Milton, which tore the roof off the Tropicana field, which is supposed to be hit the wrecking ball in 3 years so they could build this bright, shiny new stadium. And that's great, but it sounds like that people are wanting to prioritize repairing the beaches, repairing infrastructure that were damaged by this very damaging hurricane, not to mention the roof of Tropicana Field.
So, Steve, we're talking about a lot bigger thing than just a stadium here. Also, we're talking about a $1.2 billion stadium with taxpayer money going towards it. But the gas plant district is going to be redone around it. And St. Petersburg and Pinellas County have kind of decided that this is a package deal, and there's $6 billion going to go go into this project here. So do you believe, or did you get the indication from the meetings that they're willing to put all of that on the line to make sure that it's the right deal for the baseball stadium?
I think you got two things in play. You just had some elections, and you had some new members, two new members of the Pinellas County Commission that were sworn in. Unfortunately for Stuart Sternberg and the Rays, they are stadium deal opponents. So you've got 7 members of the commission, so you've tilted it over that much more. So you've got a lot of skepticism. And then I felt like that this letter that said, well, we're willing to work on a deal, but this present deal kind of fell through. I think what the team is doing here is I think they realize the numbers don't add up. There's no other reason for me just spitballing here for why they would do this letter that would go over, as Keith Moon said, like a lead balloon. And for the life of me, to me, it sounded very tone deaf. To me, the residents of St. Pete and Pinellas County can easily go, well, why are we, and several people at both of these meetings brought this up, why are we focusing so much on this baseball team and their stadium when our city's been devastated by a natural disaster?
Steve, as two people that lived in Florida previously that understand professional baseball in Florida, why in the world would a city, Miami did this too, put a bunch of money into a professional baseball stadium and then try to claim that a bunch more people are going to come watch professional baseball in Florida?
Well, the thing is so silly about that, and one of the citizens of St. Pete brought this up. Your tourism south of Gainesville is going to be in the wintertime. It's not going to be during baseball season. And the other thing is, you've been to games at the Trop. I went to a bunch of games at the Trop. I lived about an hour and a half away. And one of the interesting things I noticed was the attendance was pathetic. I have seen high school football games in Texas draw more fans than the Rays do. And the Rays, in their defense, have been a winning club. And yet they can't fill the house unless one of two teams comes to play, the Yankees or the Red Sox. Because the problem is, as you well know, just about everybody in Florida ain't from there.
Now, Steve, the more urgent issue is that this year they're going to play in the Yankees spring training home. And then the question mark is, are they going to redo the Trop? How long do they need the Trop for if they do? And who's going to pay for it? What do you know about that?
So the St. Pete City Council, right now, they're deliberating over whether to fix the roof. The roof replacement itself is going to be about $26 million, give or take. And then you need about $55 million to get the stadium ready to play again. The problem is they have to source these roof panels from overseas. Apparently, we don't have anyone here that builds those. So you got to wait for these things to be shipped. Then they say that the roof replacement won't start till June or July. And what they're doing now is they're trying to preserve the inside of the ballpark, which was not designed to be exposed to the elements. So they would start getting the roof up June or July, which is right in the middle of the rainy season, and they might have it done by November.
Now, when there's disagreements in stadium deals, we often see the professional team owners start saying, well, we're going to explore somewhere else. And the names that come up every time are Nashville, somewhere in North Carolina, Raleigh, wherever it may be. And the Rays have minor league teams there. Have we reached that point yet where they start threatening to move? Is that coming soon, or where are we at on that?
I think that letter had a thing, we're willing to work with any parties to get a stadium. That was telling. They didn't just throw that in there for kicks. And that letter, the thing that I thought was so interesting is they basically have said that we can't go forward with this deal. And the problem is they're saying that, oh, we're responsible for cost overruns. If this pushes out to 2029, we can't afford on our end to do that. And the thing that's bad for the Rays, this comes at a terrible time. You're now going to have 2 Major League Baseball teams playing in minor league baseball parks. And that is bad. And then you've got 2 teams, because obviously, as you've written about, Las Vegas and the A's are doing kind of this weird dance where we don't know where they're going to end up. They might not even go there. I mean, this stadium, from what I've read about Las Vegas, it sounds like they're having the same issues that the people of Florida are about giving the Rays a new Taj Mahal stadium.
Steve, thanks for joining us today. Listeners can keep up with this story and read more about stadiums across the country at thecentersquare.com.
Thank you, John and Steve. You're listening to the Center Square Radio Hour. I'm your host, Chris Krug. With more on what to expect on education from President-elect Donald Trump, let's now return to Eliana Kernodle.
The transition team for President-elect Donald Trump has said it will deliver on the former president's promises regarding sweeping changes to the nation's educational system and federal agencies. Joining me to discuss this is Chalkboard News editor Brennan Clary. Brennan, last week we talked some about the bigger promises and trends in education in this election, especially this idea of abolishing the Department of Education, which many scholars have argued likely couldn't be done without congressional approval, as well as school choice, which saw some mixed results in elections across the country. But Trump's team continues to promise they will deliver on education. What policies and ideas has Trump laid out on this?
Yeah, it's a great question. And specifically too, like, you know, the Trump transition team they said basically, they called it a resounding margin that Trump went by, and basically said that they gave a mandate to implement the promises he made on the campaign trail. And then said, you know, he will deliver these promises. So kind of a broad statement, but, you know, very bold. And I think that's pretty reminiscent of a lot of the kinds of promises that we heard from Donald Trump throughout the campaign on education issues. And so it's what he's said. He's listed out a number of different, you know, positions. And as you mentioned, we talked about abolishing the Department of Education, eliminating it, and then also, you know, implementing pretty broad school choice measures, you know, federally. But there's also, you know, some of those smaller things too. And I think it's helpful to drill into, like, there's some stuff that is not going to be so difficult to try to implement, or, you know, so landscape altering, but still of importance. And a lot of it too, I think, it is maybe more that local or even classroom level interaction between students and teachers, or, you know, how things are run. I think it might be helpful to just kind of read off some of the key ideas. In 2023, there was a video that the campaign put out, and essentially, you know, had a lot of these kinds of promises that he was talking about. And for one of the top in that video was putting the rights of parents first. And that's something that Republican states have seen a groundswell of support for, right? We've seen parental rights legislation in a number of red-leaning states. And so I think that's going to be a big priority of putting that first. And we've also seen, I think, a lot from the COVID-19 era. You know, parents wanted to be in control of their kids' education. They were opposed to some of this, you know, policies from school districts, but also, you know, some of the state level stuff, and wanted to be involved in their children's education. The second one was empowering parents and school boards to hire principals and teachers, and then fire those who are not doing a good job. That you might remember, I believe we talked about this in Michigan. You know, there's legislation there that makes it a little bit more difficult to fire teachers. It just kind of moves, you know, their performance around a little bit. So that might be one way to do it, is sort of have like this is a codified performance metric for teachers. Focus on, you know, reading, writing, math, science. That's a little bit harder to implement, I think, just because it's really broad. You know, you're also, it's kind of hard if you don't have a Department of Education. How do you sort of implement some of these top-down changes? I think that some of these might be, you know, a little bit contradictory, or maybe have some of these different kinds of strings attached to them. Like, how do you make sure that tools are doing that? Yeah, unless you're kind of leveraging something, you know, it just might, like, some of the stuff needs to be maybe drilled into a little bit more. So, some political statements too. I mean, a lot of that is like bringing prayer to our schools, teaching students to love their country. Some of those are, it's kind of intangible, right? Of like, how do you like require that the 10 Commandments are in classrooms, like we've seen in Louisiana, and there's, you know, the legal challenges there. Like, it's some of these broader questions. And, Another one too is the schools are safe, secure, and drug-free, with immediate expulsion for any student who harms a teacher or another student. So that one is kind of clear there, of like going back to a zero tolerance, which there's been a lot of backlash to that in recent years. I've written about restorative justice sort of as an answer to these zero tolerance policies. But I think that there might be some teachers out there who might be excited about some of these changes, given some of the climate in school, classrooms where things are contentious, and even at some point we have seen reports of students becoming violent. So it's, that might change things. And then school choice, again, we've talked about that before. That's rather broad. But then also project-based learning experiences. That's one that he talked about in 2023 here. Help train students for internships, and then also the career counseling. So like these are things that I think would be fairly easy to implement. Like that one would be fairly easy to implement at a local level, of like having a designated career counselor to help students, walk through the process of finding a job or going to a institute of higher education. So I think that, there are these, some of these are smaller and I think maybe more manageable. So it'll be interesting to see like how much, and again, it's like, what do you get from the campaign promises? Like how much do you get back there? As we mentioned last time, we've heard, a lot of GOP presidents saying we're going to abolish the Department of Education. It's still kicking. So it's kind of a question of like, how much will is behind these.
As you mentioned, school choice is kind of a big piece of this puzzle. It's one of the ones that gets the most press and people talk about a lot. But some are saying voters in this election rejected school choice. What's with the discrepancy there?
Yeah, one of our opinion contributors at Chalkboard News from EdChoice, his name is Mike McShane. He wrote a piece basically saying, Republican or school choice leaning candidates, they're the ones who won big in the election. And he said in no small part because of their stance on school choice. And he used Texas as an example where school choice candidates backed by the governor there, they won. And so they probably will have enough to pass school choice in Texas. And so that's a big contentious issue in Texas. But more broadly, that shows that voters want school choice measures, even if you had some of these high profile defeats from constitutional amendments. And he just also sort of drew a line there and said, there are probably a lot of people who want to have school choice, but they don't want to mess with their state's constitution. So they might have qualms about that.
Well, Brendan, thank you for your insights on these stories. Listeners can keep up with these stories and more at chalkboardnews.com.
Thanks to Eliana and Brendan for that update. You're listening to the Center Square Radio Hour. I'm your host, Chris Krug. Joining me to discuss the expected drop in olive oil prices is PhD economist Dr. Orphe Divounguy. Dr. O, we've had a number of conversations on the podcast over the past few years about Americans sort of hoping, wishing, waiting for prices to come down. And we have been, I think, pretty stable in our thoughts that they are not going to come down. But every once in a while, the market does show us that basic tenets of supply and demand make for buying opportunities. And one such is around olive oil. There's a terrific story on CNBC today, and the headline of that is World's Largest Olive Oil Producer Says Liquid Gold Prices on Track to Halve from Record Levels. Backstory on this is apparently in Spain, they've had a couple of years of drought prior to this growing season. This season, they have had plenty of rain, and the olive oil crops are abundant, and they are overproducing olive oil, which is going to reduce the price of olive oil. Can we talk a little bit about this, the basic tenets of supply and demand in terms of this fantastic opportunity to be buying olive oil, apparently?
Well, look, on the supply side, you have many factors, right? So you have land, you have where everything costs to produce stuff. And of course, there's always the potential of crops being destroyed by some climate event. And of course, then you end up with a shortage, and the shortage causes prices to go up. That is a potential. But basically, look, in this story, it's very clear that, you also had suppliers, right? The price paid to farmers had gone up somewhat, but that, there's other factors like supermarkets adding to that price, et cetera, right? But ultimately, the consumers have choices and consumers have options. And so now that the supply of olive oil has kicked up a notch in an environment where consumers are already starting to kind of adjust their buying habits, right? Remember, they have options. Olive oil is not the only game in town. Then, potentially you could see a price drop. And very much a story of supply and demand here. You get more supply, especially at a time where your consumer habits have changed, and you're likely going to see prices drop. So I love these types of stories, like basic economics. Right now we're seeing energy prices. Energy prices have been basically solely responsible for the cooling of headline inflation in the U.S. over the past year. Core inflation has been pretty steady.
Yes.
But energy prices dropping has provided enough downward pressure on headline inflation.
But to be clear about that, that's primarily fossil fuels, right? It's primarily oil here being drilled domestically and certainly globally that's driving these energy prices. This does not have anything to do with wind or solar necessarily, like kind of, catching the gears finally.
I mean, I pulled up the table here. We're talking about gasoline down 12% on a year-over-year basis.
Yep.
Fuel oil down 21%. We're not talking about disinflation here. We're talking about prices falling, actually falling, down 21% on a year-over-year basis.
So last time you went to the pump in suburban Seattle, what did you pay? Yeah, I'm guessing you're buying premium for that sweet vehicle of yours.
Yeah, it's way over. It was way over. I remember you filling up my truck cost me about $120. Now I'm filling it up for $100, right? I'm saving $20 each trip. It's nice. It helps your wallet for sure.
In the greater Chicago area, in the suburbs, we're seeing gasoline finally under $3 a gallon.
Yeah.
And that's with a significant amount of state and local taxes added to it. So how long, in your estimation, we're talking about fuel prices, and this really does matter. I mean, nothing against the cooks out there that like to use olive oil. But I think I use maybe a little bit more gasoline on a monthly basis than I use olive oil. How long do you think these gasoline prices are going to hang around?
It's hard to say, right? So they're kind of controlled by, producers, but also it's a global thing, right? With OPEC in the mix. And so the question becomes, okay, when are they going to pull back on supply? Right. Essentially, right? If you got to pull back, well, then we're in trouble. And the reason I say we're in trouble is because core inflation's been pretty steady.
Maybe a little bit different than olive oil. I mean, olives, they're growing. You got to pick them. You got to squeeze them.
Yeah.
I appreciate your thoughts as always, Dr. O. That'll do it for another week of the Center Square Radio Hour. Center Square Radio Hour is a production of America's Talking Network, produced by Eliana Kernodle. If you missed some of today's show, you can find it at americastalking.com. I'm Chris Krug, and on behalf of everyone at Franklin News Foundation, thank you for listening to the Center Square Radio Hour.